is one that's particularly useful. And I think one way to think about it is, we're all familiar with moods. We all know that when we have a bad mood, we see the world differently than when we have a good mood. You know, and moods come and go. You can be in a good mood in the morning and a bad mood in the afternoon, or you can, you know, you can have many moods in any given day, depending on how much happens that day. So they're very fleeting. They come and go, and but you know when you're in a bad mood, for instance, that the way you're seeing the world is going to be affected by the fact that you're in a bad mood. So that's not the best time to get into an argument. It's not the best time to draw conclusions or to make big important decisions necessarily. You know, and levels of consciousness are similar in that they're a sort of background orientation towards life that affects the way you see and the way you're able to respond to life. But they're not fleeting like moods. You don't have, you know, they don't change multiple times a day. They're more stable, they're more ongoing. I mean, it's not that, you know, in the way that David Hawkins talks about it, it's not like you can't change your level of consciousness, but all of us tend to have a certain center of gravity that we revolve around.
So say that again. You said that so well. So the levels of consciousness are, say it again, this background.
They're kind of a background orientation towards life, you know, that's there before everything else happens.
Right.
And they affect the way you see things, the way you relate things together, and the way that you're able to respond to what happens.
Well, it's interesting, too, because for the people that listened to the show last week, when Steve Zaffron was speaking about that we take action totally in a correlate with the way the world occurs to us. Mm-hmm. So the way the world looks, which is these levels of consciousness, the way it shows up is the way we respond to it, the way that we take action.
Right.
So these affect us completely. You know, the way we think, the way we see, what we see as possible, what we see as not possible, what we can do, what we can't do, what other people look like, what the world looks like, you know, so it's a big deal.
Definitely. And that's, you know, one of the ways to think about levels of consciousness is that one of the ways to think about levels of consciousness is that it affects the options we have in response to life. Right. You know, if you're at higher levels of consciousness, you have much freer and much broader. You have a much freer and much broader range of options to draw from. And as you drop lower in levels of consciousness, the amount of options that you have to respond from tend to constrict and constrict and constrict. You have less. You're less and less responsible, able to respond to life. You know, and that's why developing in terms of levels of consciousness is so critical. You know, for any of us. There's another piece
too that's brilliant. And then when we start talking about like what are the lowest level moving up, you can see how it's the most constricted at the bottom. You know, your option is whether or not to commit suicide, more or less. You know, I mean, it gets very, very, very narrow to, you know, the point of being enlightened. So your energy levels also, starting from the bottom to the most expanded possibility, you have more and more energy available as you go up as well.
Absolutely. Most definitely. So Dr. Hawkins has created a scale ranging from 1 to 1,000. You know, that's the scale that he uses. And as you get closer and closer to 1,000, you're getting you know, more open, more free, much less constricted, more enlightened, more illuminated consciousness constantly. And as you go down closer and closer to 1, you're getting more constricted, less options, more fear-based, more contracted, more protective. I mean, that would be the general movement up to down. You know, and as you said, at the very bottom, you know, what he identifies as the lowest level of consciousness is you know, has been talked about as shame or despair. And particularly despair is a very vivid word because it really means there's no hope.
Right.
You know, so if there's no hope, there's really no option. You don't really, like you said, your option is kind of you check out, kill yourself in the worst case scenario, or you decide to just subject yourself to a situation in which there's no hope.
Yeah.
It's just, and people do end up in that level of consciousness,
Sure.
and it's a horrible place to be. It's literally, there's no options, there's no hope, there's no freedom. It's almost completely constricted. And as you move up through the levels of consciousness, you go through, the way he identifies it is, there's anger, then there's desire, then there's fear, grief, apathy, guilt.
Well, it goes. Let's just do it a little like in order. So it starts off with shame and despair, which I'm sure makes sense to people. It's not like we haven't been there.
Okay.
And
Yes.
then to guilt and hate, which has a little more energy, even though it's negative.
That's right.
Apathy, and then grief, fear, desire, the kind of grasping desire, not the healthy desire. And it's healthy to some degree because it's better than being in fear, but it's still a grasping, attached quality. And then anger, which has got a hell of a lot more energy, and then pride.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are what he says. It's not even a matter of debate so much as he does muscle testing, as far as to see, he was doing muscle testing to sort of track this sort of 0 to 1,000 to see where people are and kind of what level of consciousness that they're in, and whether people believe in muscle testing or not. The body does know what is exhausting to it and what has more energy. And I'm sure, if you're with somebody who's, you have lunch with somebody who's just ranting and angry, you would leave the luncheon being somewhat exhausted.
Right.
So it has sort of a negative, draining influence. He says that everything up through pride, that has a negative quality, that when you're around people that are rooted in fear or rooted in despair or rooted in apathy, that you actually energetically become exhausted.
Right. Right.
Which I think most people could probably find in their own experience.
Right. And what's interesting about, these, this is, so on his scale, these are all the below 200 levels of consciousness, right, with shame and despair being the absolute rock bottom,
right,
and pride being just before 200. And we'll talk about why 200 is an inflection point in a moment. But very simply, what these levels of consciousness have in common is it's levels of consciousness in which it's all about you. It's not about anything besides you. So it's all about you. It's all about bringing things to you. And so it's a net negative in the universe. You're not adding anything. You're looking for something, and so even at pride, which is the highest level, you're still looking for recognition.
Right.
You're still needing something. It's not quite. Yeah, it's much higher than shame and despair or guilt or the much lower levels, but still you're not in the positive column yet.
And pride is interesting because most people think, I don't have pride, or but when we were investigating it and we were working with that with people and with ourselves, you can actually see that thinking that you already know, being very identified with your accomplishments, not being open to other people's perspectives, or not just being open in general, and being very opinionated and defensive in a certain way, with your thinking and stuff. People go there. That's
Mm-hmm.
not a unusual place for us to be. And most really highly successful people get stuck in pride.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to get a visceral sense of these. If you think of someone who's really in despair, and you're around them, most people, you don't get that many. Hopefully, you don't have that many opportunities. But
right.
But if you are in that kind of, you can really feel how much the person needs. The
Yes.
amount of need that's coming from someone like that is almost unbearable.
Yeah, it's true.
And as you get to pride, if you're in a conversation with someone and they're in a prideful place, even if it's just that they're very certain about what they know and they're really not open to anything else, it's not, they're not expressing the kind of need that someone in despair is. But still, a conversation like that gets tiring because they need you to agree with them. And you feel it. And after a while, you're just like, I don't want to talk to this person anymore.
Right.
This is not, but someone else could have exactly the same beliefs, but they're actually being generous in the conversation. They're interested in what you have to say, and they don't just want to defend what they know. They actually want to find out what's true, and then you want to be in that conversation.
That's true. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break in a moment, just a short break, which is perfect. It's like the perfect timing. So we've just done like what's below 200. So what is sort of identifying to some degree, what is then exhausting. And then we're going to do above 200 after the break, which is where the doorway to higher consciousness is. So
perfect timing.
So we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. It's Patricia Albere and Jeff Carreira, and we are discussing what is the portal to higher states of consciousness. And we've been talking about what are the different levels of consciousness. And before the break, we were speaking about what we call as under 200. And it's the emotional levels of consciousness that are basically more selfish and self-centered and obviously very human, but definitely are a drain to ourselves and actually don't really contribute particularly to the world. And so we're going to talk about this flip of like what happens when you move from pride and below up to above 200. So do you want to talk about what's the first place above?
Right, and just to remind everyone that we're talking about particularly David Hawkins' levels of consciousness, from his scale, and we're just saying that at the point of 200, there's an inflection point in consciousness that he identifies that I think is deeply insightful, and everything below 200, as we said, essentially takes. Right up to pride, which is closest to giving but not quite. And there's still someone who's in a prideful level of consciousness is still wanting something for themselves. And above pride, as you flip through this 200 inflection point, you get to courage. And courage, by definition, means that you are willing to sacrifice. You're willing to risk. And if you imagine a conversation with someone who's in pride, and you can feel that they are defended around something that they know, it takes an act of courage for them to open up to the possibility that they could be wrong.
Right.
And if you're in a conversation like that, you'll feel the inspiration when someone flips. They'll be defended, they'll be defended, they'll be defended. And the moment they go, well, maybe I'm wrong, you'll feel that they had to give something in order for that to happen. And you'll feel like you got something there. Yeah. And until that point in consciousness, you're not really getting any. It's taking, and courage is where you actually. Courage is the level of consciousness in which you start to be capable of giving. Giving
with
back.
Courage too. I mean, the thing that I think is really important for people to hear, and I know it's an important thing for me to remember, and to remember always. Is that courage is always courage. So no matter how amazing you are and how far you go on the path, you still have to have courage. You can't just go, okay, I already got that. I've already done courage. It always takes you to your edge.
Right.
And to where you need to be open and where you need to take a risk and tell the truth and be authentic and do what would be truly courageous for you, which might be different for someone else. Right. And I think that's why we love those movies. I mean, I do anyway. Where Rudy, I remember there's that movie Rudy, or there's people where it's like dun 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 dun. That people are doing something, and all of a sudden they have this amazing amount of courage, and you could feel the whole audience starts cheering. Because you feel the energy. It's like that part of us that knows that we have to have that in us as human beings. It's necessary if you want to actually move your life to another level, and we can talk about what some of the other levels are.
Right. And you can see another thing about courage is at that flipping point, then it stops being only about you. Courage is always about, there may be, still a lot that's about you, but there's at that point something that's about something outside of you. which is where the giving comes from. So in the example of someone in a prideful conversation, when they get to the point where they're going to open up to the truth, they're not only doing that for themselves, because they already think they know anyway. So as far as they're concerned, they just know. But they're doing it for the truth. Some part of them wants to actually know what's true. So it's a little beyond just them at that point, because it'd be easier just to know. And that's why it's such a beautiful turning point in consciousness, and so important for all of us to really recognize. And your point is perfect, which is you can't rest in courage.
No.
It's always
unfortunately.
Unfortunately, it's always going to be a step into the unknown. And if you did that step already, it's not courage anymore.
Well, we also, there's another thing that I'm very excited about, and I've spoken about before, but that this quality of the truth, that under 200, this was one of the things that was revelatory for me when I read his take on this, because there are other systems, the Sedona method has a certain way of seeing levels of consciousness, and I can't remember the other one, but there was one that we worked with Werner Erhard 1,000 years ago, that was breaking down these different levels. But what I love is what he says is that under 200, you cannot count on people to be in the truth.
Right.
So under 200, people are invested in looking good and protecting themselves. They're in fear, they're in desire, they're wanting something, they're apathetic. So the strength that it takes to actually be in the truth and have the kind of integrity of somebody who's authentic, you absolutely cannot count on them.
Right. That makes total sense.
And that crossover point, too, with courage has to do with, it's the first time where a person goes, you know what, I want to be in the truth, even if it's a risk, even if I'm going to get in trouble, even if I'm going to lose my job. It's like, I'm going to be authentic, and I'm going to have integrity here, period. And something opens up. What people don't realize is that when you move into that level of consciousness and your integrity is to be of someone who's going to be authentic and transparent and for real, is, you don't have to worry about getting a job. It's like people that are like that don't have a problem, actually. Do you know what I mean? You have courage and you start to move into these higher levels of consciousness. All the things that you're terrified about underneath 200 really no longer apply, because those kind of people are more rare and they're highly desirable.
Right, definitely.
Interestingly enough, when you're not manipulating how everybody sees you.
And it goes right there. All these go hand in hand, because everything below courage, the bottom line is going to be selfishness.
Yes.
And at the very bottom of the scale, you're almost completely self-centered. If you're in despair, you don't really have room for anybody else.
That's true.
And when you get just below courage, you probably have room for other people, but your bottom line is still for yourself. You're still out for yourself. When push comes to shove. And the beautiful thing about courage is you might still be selfish a lot of the time.
Right.
But when push comes to shove and the chips are up against the wall, your bottom line isn't selfish anymore. Your bottom line is for the truth. Yeah. And that's why you can trust somebody.
And you can be encouraged about anything. So, you can have grief or anger or desire or whatever. I mean, that's human, to have different kinds of emotions.
Right.
But you can be courageous about those emotions. You can be vulnerable. You can be real about them. It's not that you're always positive and, have your little sword out and you're on your horse,
Right. No, and this is probably a discussion for another time, but an interesting thing about the Hawkins levels of consciousness is I think we have a center of gravity of where we've developed to up until this point. Right. And then you have transitory states of consciousness. Someone dies and you're going to fall in, you end up in a challenging situation, you're going to experience a lot of fear, and that's going to dominate your consciousness. But still, where are you going to be relating to that from?
Right.
It's I think in the evolutionary collective, one of the beautiful things that we're working on is really defining what it means to have second order relationships to our other relationships. We're not just having a fear relationship to life. we're having a relationship to the fact that we might be experiencing fear in relationship to life.
Yeah.
There's
And in culture, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is if the culture was one of let's support each other to be above 200, let's be courageous and let's be willing. Willingness is one of the ones that's even higher than that, and willingness, is the place where you kind of overcome your inner resistance to life. I think deep down people are. I mean, I've called it like speed bumps. It's like we have this sort of inner speed bump where it's like you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, I have to go brush my teeth. And, there's just this resistance, this general resistance to it all.
right.
And in willingness, and you can feel it in people when they're no longer resisting, they're just in life and they're here and it's a yes. And there's a kind of, they're like ball bearings, that have no friction. It's utterly different.
Right.
It's utterly different. And so if you have a culture where you agree to be that way, so we're inspiring each other to be courageous and willing instead of grumbling, together, having our coffee and complaining or being in some kind of negative state about life. It's a lot easier if you have other people that are supporting you.
And this is, I think, in terms of our conversation today and in terms of the work that we're doing together in the Evolutionary Collective, we are essentially, courage is the first level of consciousness above the 200 line, the first one that's in the plus column. Willingness is a little above that. And we're really, in the Evolutionary Collective, working to hold that as the band that we're, at least as our center of gravity, we're holding. And the reason willingness is high is a higher level of consciousness than courage. Like I said, courage is your bottom line is you're ready. You might be resisting, but if push comes to shove, you're ready. Right. But in willingness, you're actually just ready.
Yeah.
You're not resisting and can be pushed to ready. You are on the edge. You're leaning forward and you're ready to go. And that's, this is called the gateway to higher consciousness, and the way Dr. Hawkins talks about it, that relationship to life, which is you're embracing being here, you're leaning forward, and you are ready. That when you get to that place, then that opens up all the possibilities above willingness. Yeah. All the possibilities for illumination and enlightenment and higher consciousness.
And also success. I mean, if you really, when you have someone who is in that state, and they're positive and they, can throw themselves into things and still recover, and they're resilient and resourceful, and they have this yes, they're just basically, okay, yeah, sure, great, they're going to do it. It's so incredibly attractive and compelling. I mean, you just want to keep them forever. It's like somebody who's got that quality is so gorgeous. And they can learn everything, and everything can come to them. It's people that are grumbly, and and that's within our control. I mean, that's why in the days of the monastery, or a place where people wanted to become enlightened, they worked a lot to get the people up to willingness.
Right. Definitely.
Okay, get up at 4 a.m, and people would be like, oh no. And then they'd have to get up, and eventually they would just surrender and no longer resist. It had that sort of jump, how high.
Right. And the beautiful thing is also that we're not talking about an undiscriminating willingness. It's not like you'll just say yes to anything, but you're always willing, and when someone's always willing, and then maybe there's something they just say no to, you'll know there's a good reason. It's not because they're just unwilling. It's because there's something that makes it not the right thing to do. And you can kind of see, once you get to the point of when you're with someone who's willing, and they're really willing, they're ready, you don't really have to worry much. You can put so much of your attention forward, because you don't have to worry that they're holding back, that they're resisting. You can trust, you mentioned trust. It's like there's another level of trust that can kick in at that point, because It is, military metaphors come to mind. When teams are really crack teams, and this person is not going to hesitate,
Yeah.
then you don't have to worry about them. You can act in unison, and that's a beautiful thing that human beings can do. They can really be ready, and they can be together in readiness, and then they become a non-issue for each other.
Right.
And they can put their attention on the real issue, which is whatever is the task ahead.
And that's obviously, important for the people listening in their individual lives, but clearly on the planet, given the things that are happening globally, we need to be able to come together into a place of willingness and above.
Right.
Because otherwise it's all about us and our interpersonal dynamics and our personal, grief resistance.
Right.
Rather than, as you said, perfectly, coming together so that it's not really about us and it's about what we're taking on. Instead of about our stuff that we've put in the way of what we're taking on.
Right. It's an important point because you can see in terms of our global challenges, often the problem isn't that we don't have solutions or potential solutions. The problem is you can't garner the collective will that would allow you to put the solutions into practice. Certainly you have to work out the solutions, and there may be different ideas, and you'd have to figure out which was best. But if you can't get people to enact the solution, if you can't get people to use less energy, if you can't, then your problem isn't, it's not that too much energy is getting used, it's that you can't garner the collective will to enact the solution.
Right. Well, look at Congress. The
absolutely.
Right? If they were up to willingness, if they were beyond pride, and they moved up to courage and above, we would have a completely different situation.
Right, and the interesting thing is it doesn't mean there wouldn't be differences of opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
But you'd be in a position where you could work through them fairly quickly and figure out what was best in any given moment for a given outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
You wouldn't be stuck forever.
Interesting. So it also, what was I going to say? Anyway, I forgot. It disappeared.
Well, I think, maybe just to say a moment, because I think where we want to go is to talk about, because it's one thing for the individual to hold these, but making it a cultural goal, a culture meaning for more than one person to be doing this together, and for all those people to know that the others are doing it. Brings it to a whole other dimension, and in the evolutionary collective, the commitments that we make to each other is that we are going to be, we're not going to fall below courage.
Yeah.
And of course, we're going to have our moments, as everybody does, but when you have those moments and it gets pointed out to you, and you realize, oh my God, it's true, I'm in pride, or I'm in anger, or
fear.
Fears, but it's at the moment at which you recognize that that's the case is the moment that you can decide to be courageous about it.
And then you don't really have the option. You kind of give up your right to indulge in your fear as being more dominant than, which we need. We actually, I think as human beings, we need to have either like we have it in a collective experience. It could be an evolutionary relationship. It could be a relationship where you just go, okay, you and me, we're going to, when push comes to shove, I'm not going to convince you of my fear.
Right.
I'm going to go for it.
And I'm not going to fight for my fear.
Yeah, I'm not going to say, you don't understand. It's really scary.
Right.
You're going to find some way to intelligently move forward. So we're gonna just take one more short break, and then when we come back, we're also going to talk about what's beyond courage and willingness, so that you can see, what happens and the other. We're still only up to about 350. There's still another 650.
Right. There's a lot further to go.
Levels of energy to go. So, okay. So Jeff and I will be talking about that when we get back. Okay. Hey, welcome back, everyone. This is Patricia Albere and Jeff Carreira, and we are talking about the portal to higher levels of consciousness. We were just before well, the two times before the break, we were talking about the lower levels of consciousness and then this transition point where you move from pride, which is still a draining kind of energy, to courage and willingness, and that the whole thing shifts and you actually start to become more positive, more generous. And it's something, too, that just to remember, we have a choice about this. We don't always have a choice about what we're afraid of or what we are angry about or, what we don't like in the world. But we always have a choice about being courageous. We can always take a risk. We can always open up. We can always be honest. We can always be truthful. Those things are not undoable. And that's a really important point, because this is really an access point, and there's no way around it. I mean, that's the part that I really wanted to share with everyone is, having courage and being in the truth in those things. If you don't do that, you're condemned to living in a certain state of a certain realm of consciousness that's really not very wonderful.
Right, absolutely.
And it really is up to us.
And you could see that level of courage and willingness, as the portal to everything. If you just think about it, you want to be with people who are courageous and willing, as opposed to cowardly and resistant.
Yeah, really.
I mean, you want to be with people who are courageous and willing. Those are the kind of people who are on the edge, and they're ready to go. And they're not hampered, by all kinds of, whatever's trailing them. They're really ready, and that's the kind of people we all want to be with. And I think as we enter into relationships with each other, of course, we all want the people around us to be courageous and willing, and then we have to be, in that case, willing to look at ourselves and say, I need to be courageous and willing for everybody else. And that's where it gets mutual, because I want them to be it for me and I want to be it for them. And then you've got something powerful.
Someone can be in any situation. They can be, dying of cancer or, something that's so difficult. Or that they've been depressed for so long, or, whatever it is. It can be really, really hard stuff. And when someone acts with courage, you can let whoever's relating to them, you can feel the lift. It's like some little part of heaven shows up.
Definitely.
It's
Absolutely.
The sweetest. And kids, like all those little kid movies, always have like the kid that's getting beaten up and then finally he gets courageous. Everybody starts cheering. There just is something innate about this. I wanted to say what some of the other levels are, just to at least introduce the other 650, all the way up to 1,000. 1,000 is pure enlightenment. It's like Christ consciousness, Buddha consciousness, the very highest possibility. So it goes up with courage and willingness and acceptance, reason, unconditional love, joy, ecstasy, peace, bliss, self-realization, and enlightenment. And there are actually, I do highly recommend the book. I think it's quite wonderful. It's Transcending the Levels of Consciousness by Dr. David Hawkins. And he illuminates, with whole chapters, what the qualities and characteristics are. And I found that a really useful way to work with the book, especially if you can feel how resistant you are to life, or whatever part that you're struggling with. If you just read willingness over and over and start to take out some of those qualities and just try to enact one of them that day, to say yes when you would normally say no, or to be a little less grouchy, or whatever it is, it starts to move you in a different direction. You can actually feel more energy start to come into your life and support you in going in that direction.
Right. And I was just thinking, it's interesting to think about willingness in relationship to those higher levels of consciousness, because, in this scheme, willingness is identified as the portal. And of course, the word willingness comes from the root will. which is intention.
Right.
And so willingness is sort of like intentioningness. It's a self-direct, it's a leaning towards the ability to self-direct, and I know in the work that I have done for years with Enlighten Next, intention is such an important point, and I'm kind of connecting it with this because we're really interested in higher development into these spiritual realms, and of course spiritual practices of different types are often associated with how you get into those higher realms, how you develop. But what's so important is how are you engaged with spiritual practices? Are you engaged from willingness? Or because people can do spiritual practices, you can be fearful and do spiritual practices, but then that's not going to be the gateway into higher consciousness. The person who's engaged with those kind of higher practices has to be at least they have to be at that willing, intentionful, leaning forward, ready to go play. If you're not ready to go, then why do the practice? Because
It's true.
as many of us know, you can do practices, you can even have powerful spiritual experiences from doing it from fear, perhaps, but you're not ready. So the portal to illumination could open right in front of your eyes, but if you're fearful, you'll just recoil.
It's true.
But if you're ready to surrender. You're ready to dive in. So you need to be, it's more important for you to be sure that you're at willingness than it is to do spiritual practice. Because there's no sense doing spiritual practices if you're not at willingness.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's a really, really good point.
And I'm sure that's
just
what...
Look at that even before you sit down. Like, can you find that place of yes, that place of, okay, I'm ready. I'm here. Let's go.
Right.
Instead of, oh, I have to sit here. People, that's why it takes 20 years, right? Because people are just sitting there resisting.
Right. Right, exactly.
Basically.
I mean, people can do spiritual practices forever and not really transform. And they can have incredible spiritual experiences and not transform because they're not really ready.
Yep.
And that's why the most important practice for any of us is to get very clear about whether we're ready. Because when you're ready, you're ready.
And also, some of the keys are also things you can work with that you can get your hands on is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So you can always examine, am I actually communicating the truth? Am I living the truth? Am I acting according to what is really true? Am I congruent with the truth?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
definitely.
doable.
Absolutely.
The other thing is, whether you're being resistant. Do I mean to keep eliminating in any way you can places of where you feel entitled to be resistant?
Right. Definitely.
Where you complain or make it, you drag your feet or, you're kind of ambivalent and you're not really, don't really know if you want to. And, there's sort of all that sort of ways of being as a human being that we feel entitled. We don't even think about it. I mean, we just think that's how you are. Right,
definitely. And as we wake up to that, then it becomes, in terms of another tangible, it becomes very important to be able to know the difference between being discerning and discriminating versus being resistant.
Yes.
Because they can masquerade as the same thing, because once you've kind of got to the point where you realize you can't really be resistant, you can kind of pretend you're being discriminating when you're actually being resistant. You actually have already made the discrimination, but you're not admitting it to yourself, and you're hanging out in resistance, pretending you're still figuring it out.
That's another reason why it's great to have spiritual partners
Definitely.
that are equally committed, because if they're awake and discerning, they can go, Jeff, wait a second. We can challenge each other from love.
Right.
Because people in the world are often also steeped in their own resistance. So you can get away with a lot and then remain in that lower state of consciousness, which is keeping your life stuck.
Right.
Because nobody's awake.
I've noticed that there's a fairly easy way to tell whether you're in resistance or discrimination.
What?
Because if you're legitimately trying to discriminate, but you're coming from a place of willingness, you'll be very engaged in the act of discrimination. You'll be really wanting to find out.
Uh-huh.
But if you're actually resistant, you'll notice you're a little fuzzy, but you're not really completely engaged in the act of getting clear. You know, it's like you don't really want to find the answer, and you're not really engaged with what it would take to find the answer. And then, you know, you can be immediately suspicious.
Well, the other thing too is just to speak to, you know, those people that are out there that are also teachers like ourselves. You know, if you're a therapist, if you work with people, I mean, you can see this.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
You can't do a whole hell of a lot with people until they get to the place where they're courageous and willing to be in the truth and be less resistant.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
as you know, I mean, you're, you know, Andrew Cohen, who's an awakened teacher. You know, I mean, it almost doesn't matter what skill set you have. You can't really give to people unless they're willing.
Right. Right. Absolutely. There's no
And a lot of the work
way.
is just to try to get them to the point where they're open.
In a certain way, almost all of the work is that.
Is that? I know.
Because once somebody's willing, it's almost a sure bet. Because at that point, they'll do what they need to do. They almost don't need you anymore.
It's true.
Because they're ready to go. And before that, nothing you do besides getting them ready. You know, you mentioned Andrew. So Andrew Cohen calls it ready to be ready. You know, most people are just getting ready to be ready. But if you get someone who's ready, then worlds open up at that point because they're ready.
True. So,
The
I mean,
universe will open for you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the courage and the willingness, and then those other very beautiful levels of love and joy and ecstasy and peace and bliss. I mean, the gravity starts pulling you up.
Definitely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I guess gravity pulls you down, and then there's grace that pulls you up.
Right. Gravity pulls you down. And in Andrew's work, he talks about 51%. He uses different terminology, but I think the 200 point is more or less the same thing that he's pointing to when he says you get to 51%, you start to have a backdraft that's pushing you forward.
Yeah.
And below 51%, you've got a gravity that's pulling you down.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I hope, you know, this has been useful for people and that you can take this into your heart. Obviously, you know, as we've said, you know, either to have another person in your life, to have an evolutionary relationship with someone, or to be a part of a group where you begin to create a culture of that this is what you're committed to.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than everybody gets to be wherever they are, that you're actually saying, no, let's keep doing our best to be at courage and to try to be willing and to try to develop those qualities together and really support each other in that. And culture, you know, relationships and culture are always based on agreement. And I think a lot of times we don't even examine what agreements we have. You know, sometimes we have an agreement to complain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's kind of what we're trafficking in. Or we have an agreement to make sure that the other person feels that their self-image is supported. You know, that they feel that they are who they think they are. And you don't challenge that,
mm-hmm.
which is obviously different than this. So what else? Anything else that you want to say? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our show next week.
Well, I guess the only thing I would add to that is as you were saying, being at willingness as an individual is one thing, mm-hmm. but being in a relationship of two or more individuals who are committed that together it's not just, you know, 1 + 1 = 2. You know, it's something else happens when you're engaged with other people and with that shared agreement to be in willingness. You know, the possibilities that become available are sort of exponentially, you know, greater. Which is what, you know, and this is what we need in the world. We need people to come together in consciousness of courage and willingness and above. And that's how we're going to be able to take this whole planet to the next level.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we need to develop that together too, to support
mm-hmm.
each other, to move the whole planet. If we can all get above 200, we get the planet above 200, that would make a different world.
They sure would.
Definitely. So a couple things I want to share about our next show. So thank you again, and Jeff and I will be together again next month.
Thank all of
So
you.
thank you. And the show next week I'm excited about is interesting. About 6 years ago, I was living in Boulder, and I decided to do a course called The Future of Money by a man named Bernard Laeter, who was one of the people who had designed the euro. And it was really interesting. It was this whole new conversation about money and, complementary currencies and different ways to see economics. And it was fascinating. I was kind of surprised I took it, but I just felt drawn, and I started to get interested in that there's a whole wonderful group of people that are innovating these new ways for us to look at money, which is such a core, essential part of our culture and a part of the way that we deal with resources and our jobs. So next week, the title of the show is Sacred Economics, an economics based on love and generosity, and it's with Charles Eisenstein, who is one of these revolutionary thinkers and authors, and we'll be talking about, what it looks like in the world, what it could look like in the world to have a different way of perceiving economics and a different way of dealing with money. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I hope this was useful for you and in your life and for today. And I'll see you next week.
Bye. Thank you.